Hello, I am your host, Matthew R. Carpenter. I'm an attorney. Today's topic is suing for a bit, or should I say a Bitcoin of justice. This podcast is based on a law review article written by Edmund Brose titled Suing for a Bitcoin of Justice, Class Actions and the Role of Technology in Morrison Extraterritoriality Analysis. Do y'all remember the FTX collapse? I mean, just a huge shit show fallout, billions supposedly lost in fraud, and it's stretched all across the globe. And it throws up this really thorny legal question, right? When you have these massive crypto frauds happening, potentially involving people and platforms everywhere, all around the world, especially the US, the implications and the liability are not simple to address. So today, we're doing a deep dive into a source that really tackles this head on. It looks at how U.S. securities anti-fraud laws, the big one, Section 10B, and specifically how courts are applying it through the key Supreme Court case, Morrison v. National Australia Bank, which discusses how that whole framework applies to crypto scams that have these international links. We're often seeing this come up in investor class actions, right? Our mission really is to unpack the challenges the courts are running into when they try to pinpoint where these digital transactions actually happen, and we'll explore a specific approach this source proposes. An approach to maybe bring some clarity, hopefully deter fraud and, protect U.S. investors. Yeah, that's the goal. Let's get into it. What's really fascinating, I think, is seeing in these, decades old legal ideas that were built for like physical stock exchanges, right? The Wall Street ticker kind of stuff. Also trying to make sense of the decentralized borderless crypto trades, this new advent of technology that we're all grappling with. And the core issue that really comes from the Morrison decision, in my opinion, is that it basically limits the reach of Section 10B Section 10B fraud rules, mainly to what it calls domestic transactions. Don't like that. But what makes crypto transactions domestic? The exchange could be software access from anywhere, right? So Morrison kind of gives you two main paths. Whether the trade is on a US stock exchange, which obviously is not an option, right? That does not happen for crypto. Or alternatively, did the purchase or sale of the security occur in the United States? And that's really the sticking point for crypto, right? Like, how do we determine if the transaction or the fraud actually occurred here? So how have courts tried to answer that? That's the $1 million question. Well, they grasp at a few things, like looking at where the transactions get validated on the blockchain by a node, right? And so where the computer servers are sort of at, I think that's where the node analysis is looking. But honestly, that sounds terrible, or not terrible. It sounds problematic, right? Because nodes could be anywhere, right? They move around. And the source argues that focusing on node locations creates these sort of legal fictions. It just doesn't match how the tech actually works. It feels like we're trying to nail water to the wall. It leads to unpredictable results, and it doesn't really track back to the main goal, which is protecting US investors. You're trying to tie this fluid digital thing to a specific, maybe temporary physical spot that isn't really where the deal was struck between the people involved. And the point of Morrison is partly about preventing US courts getting swamped with totally foreign disputes, while still making sure US markets and US investors are protected from fraud, even if the fraudsters are overseas. Okay, so if no location is a bit of a dead end, what's the alternative? The sources put forward. Let me wrap my head around this for a second, guys. So how do we get back to the policy goal? Well, the proposal provided by the sources, if I recall correctly, is actually very simple and maybe even more practical. Forget the nodes and all of that. Focus on the physical location of the people involved instead. The actual buyer or seller, specifically where the buyer or seller was physically located at the exact moment they became legally bound to the deal. So where was the person sitting, basically, when they clicked the confirm purchase? They clicked to confirm the purchase and couldn't back out. That's the idea. The source argues if either the buyer or the seller was physically in the US at that key moment, just one of them, mind you, if either was in the US at that point, that should be enough to call it a domestic transaction under Morrison. For things like crypto, it ties it directly back to the US connection. That seems much more grounded in reality, and the source adds another helpful piece. Evidence that crypto was heavily marketed in the US, right? This could be another factor that courts consider to figure out whether or not the transaction is domestic. That alone isn't or wouldn't be enough to make it domestic, right? But it's a strong plus factor. It helps show the scheme deliberately targeted Americans, strengthening the case for U.S. jurisdiction. And jurisdiction is all about factors sometimes, guys. Sometimes there's no bright line rule, as you all should know if you're lawyers, right? Like sometimes it's a compilation of things that must be considered. It helps courts catch U.S. focused fraud without, overreaching into purely foreign stuff. So, okay, let's boil this down. We've got old laws, new borderless tech, and the Morrison case saying fraud laws mainly apply to domestic transactions. And courts trying things like node location, which isn't really working well. And the source suggests look at where the buyer or seller physically was when they committed to the deal. That's your anchor point. Plus, consider if they were targeting the US market. That's the core argument. It's presented as a more practical approach, better aligned with the goals of protecting US investors from fraud while providing a significant US connection. At the end of the day, I think it really highlights how tough it is applying these concepts, right? Jurisdiction is just ugh, ah. The law moves so much slower than technology too, as you all know. Come on, these firms are we're trying to give them up to date. The younger generation, we're trying, right? And it leaves us with a big question, maybe for you, the listener, and anybody else who comes across this, right? To think about if these digital transactions can genuinely happen anywhere or maybe everywhere simultaneously, how should our laws evolve? How do we ensure accountability, protect people without either making the laws unenforceable or turning U.S. courts into like a global police for everything? Like we don't want that. And maybe they're already clogged enough as it is, right? And maybe think about what other areas of law might be facing similar headaches as technology keeps blurring these physical lines. It's a fascinating challenge. Watching traditional legal ideas grapple with decentralized text is happening right now in real time in the courts. Definitely something to keep an eye on. All right, well, that wraps up this episode. Thank you for joining.